All right, everyone. Welcome to the pop-up school at the STOA. This is a crossover event with the STOA and the pop-up school. And for those of you who are here or watching that are not familiar with the pop-up school, it's not a newsletter, it's a campus. That's all things. That is the genius of Bonnitta Roy, and they have a thriving community there. And we're going to get a taste of what that's like today. And how this session came about is our good friend Campbell Dixon, who's a Stoan and a member of the pop-up school. He reached out to Bonnitta and me to suggest this event, the nice edge of trauma, because Bonnitta has a really good sense about the contours of this concept and phenomenon. So we're going to talk about that today. And this is an invitation for anyone part of the pop-up school and the Stoa community. If you think Bonnitta would have a good presentation or session that's at the intersection here that would go on the YouTube channel, feel free to reach out. We're probably going to have more of these. So I'm going to tag in Campbell. He's going to kind of explain how he got inspired to suggest this, and then Bonnitta's going to jump in. And this, I don't know what's going to happen in this session, but it's going to have definitely a pop-up school feel to it. So that being said, Campbell, I'm taking you in, my friend.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm just so excited and honored to be here with Bonnie for this conversation. I'm really glad that we have this space. So thank you, Peter. I think this is going to hopefully bring a lot of important progress and new information to the discussions on trauma, which have helped me so much and which we hear a lot about. So yeah, like everything else that Bonnie talks about, she brings like a really fresh and unique and kind of mold breaking perspective to trauma. So I heard about her, she brought it up in one of the BSD sessions about the core self, and it just caught my ear. There was a little bit of info on it, and I just really wanted to hear more. And I kind of entered the pop-up school from those sessions a couple months ago. After I graduated in December from my undergrad in psychology, I was looking for more, I wanted to build out my experience in the pop-up school. It's just a perfect extension of that. Really kind of helped me solidify a lot of insight and curiosity, and Bonnie's methodologies and lessons there are like phenomenal. So I just want to personally recommend it. I think I see some fellow pop-up school students here, and I'm sure they can attest to the experience of being in the school, studying with Bonnie. There's an amazing archive and new sessions each month. So actually, she's starting a new one tomorrow on the core self. So join us. It's going to be great. But yeah, that's basically how this whole storm got started in me. And I think what intrigued me and caught my eye about it is that Bonnie was sort of differentiating between experiences which we should call trauma and those that we should not. And this was a really unique frame. So I think we're going to dig into that. And I hope it's insightful, as insightful as the pop-up school has been for me. And yeah, without further ado, pass it to you, Bonnie. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for being willing to have the conversation today.
Awesome. So it is, I have to admit, I have some trepidation on what we're going to do today. I mean, the thing about the pop-up school, we do 8-week courses. We have a lot of time to introduce surprising material and digest it and make distinctions. But I don't want to deliver a presentation that's a light version of what I would normally say. So there's kind of a compression of material that is happening today. So what I want to start out with is I want people to do a self-assessment right now. And that self-assessment will go from 0 to 5, which is very high. So 0 is nothing, 1 is a little, 5 is very high. And then after you assess, just put your number in the chat so we just get a sense of the collective kind of resonance. And I'm not really interested is, oh, this person's very high on this person, but just kind of where we're at, what type of nervous system am I speaking to this morning? Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. We'll do some self-assessment. This is just, it's not rigorous. It's just to give a sense of, oh, everyone's around a 3 or a lot, there's a lot of 4s and 5s here. And this will help us decide how to pace the material. Okay, is everybody up for that? So 0 is nothing, 5 is very high. Okay, so if my job today was to tell you that your trauma is not trauma, how much resistance do you feel to that? Okay, this is very helpful because if I was speaking to a bunch of 4s and 5s, I would have to spend a lot more time framing. It's very interesting to get serious about, it's very interesting to get serious about a topic that's so sensitive without moving into coaching and counseling and psychotherapy. Okay, so we're playing with fire here, and we're just trying to cook a nice warm chicken soup in the process. So so that was very helpful. Those of you at the further end, please try to lean in with us and please ask questions, okay, because we're going to do a pretty deep dive in a kind of a quick dump here. Okay, now from 0 to 5, and we'll use this term as we start. How present is your trauma in your life today? So you're an adult. How much does it intrude in your life? If it's a daily thing and it's really distorts who you are, that could be a 5. If it's present all the time, but it's kind of like your old cranky friend, that could be a 1 or 3. So just put from 1 to 5, how present is your trauma in your daily life today? Of course, we're just talking about your right today, because tomorrow you might fall in love and then notice that it's very present, right? Like this is all very contextual, depending upon how your life is going. It's not just on or off. It's got a radar of its own. Okay, now is the third and final question. How much? Yeah, right now it's just trauma. Whatever, however you're going to relate to that word, we're going to see that it's a messy word, right? It's like that's just one of the problems with it. But yeah, as long as you can just rate yourself, we're really talking about your nervous system. We're not really interested in the specifics yet, but yes, it's exactly one of the problems. Okay, so the third problem is how much has these two questions changed your nervous system right now from 1 to 5? Okay, so the first thing I want to say is if these questions changed your nervous system to quite a lot, relaxed it, that's interesting. If it hyped up your nervous system, what I want to say is there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's no pejorative that your nervous system goes up or down. And in my, I can't give you all the theory, but in my one of the conclusions in my work is that there's no problem with that. Okay, there's no problem with that. There may be a problem that jumpy nervous system makes you uncomfortable, and we could look at that. Why are you uncomfortable with a jumpy nervous system? But the fact that the nervous system does what it does, we don't problematize in my work. Okay, does that make sense? Are there any questions or comments? Hi, Gabriella. Nice to see you. Okay, so, I was thinking today, thank you for doing that. I was thinking today about how to frame this to the Stoa people. And I think it has something to do with, I never thought of this before, but I thought of it while I was meditating on how to step back and frame it. And I think it has something to do with Zach Stein's 3-part, pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic, which I think many of you are probably familiar with. He talks about like, and I think that there's something like that going on in current research on trauma. And that is, when I was growing up, all kinds of parents did raise their kids in all kinds of what we would consider strange, crude ways. And nobody called it trauma. Okay, so it was pre-tragic, right? There was no tragedy in that. I mean, there was I don't want to get into all my stories. I mean, I have a lot of stories, but there were people who were obviously way over the top, abusive to their kids. But in general, just regular parenting styles, people would be freaked out today if this happened. So it's kind of like a pre-tragic kind of scene. I used to have slap fights with my father. He tickled me once so much I reached into the cupboard and got a cast iron pan and knocked him out with it. I mean, we were like wild people, right? And the office, this was kind of normal. My mother used to fight with her neighbor because she had 2 boys and we were 2 girls, and we would fight, and they would get into these horror like this is a pre-tragic world. Does that make sense? So we want to see trauma as having grown with a cultural change also. And now we enter into the thick of the tragic, where like I've shown videos of there's this phenomenon where babies, if you put them in a car and they go through a tunnel, their eyes get really big, and sometimes people cry because they project that there's some abuse going on with the child, and it's just a biological reaction. So this is like the thick of the trauma industry. Like everything is either experienced as trauma, or we project that there's a lot of trauma going on, right? So this is what I would call the tragic scene, right? Where it seems to be following this architecture that Zach Stein has outlined. And I think what I'm saying is that there's a lot of interest in people I've been speaking with, many of you who speakers on the STOA, in articulating a post-tragic methodology, framework, concept, model, intervention of what we would call trauma. And then, so that became the question. the question that I lead with is, bad things happen to people. Like, none of what I'm going to say is meant to take away any of the actuality of the events in your life. My question is the language and framework of trauma the best approach, methodology, framework, mental model to alleviate the suffering that comes with that? That's the question, okay? So now, professionals aren't the only ones to blame. We have TV and we have pop psychology and we have, so this word, as I think Esperanza said, means a lot of things, right? It means a lot of things. And so the first thing I want to do, I read the other day, I was searching on the internet for definitions, and the definition of trauma was an adverse event that comes with negative emotion. That's kind of a silly term for trauma, right? Like, an adverse effect should come with negative emotion. This would be life. This would be a functioning feedback loop in your nervous system. And so that's how broad some of the definitions have come. Now, in order to try to get to what we are talking about in terms of trauma, we're all going to have to come to some agreement on what we're going to have that word mean today. There's two types of definitions of a stress disorder. So this is my neutral term for trauma, stress disorder, okay? So when I say stress disorder, I'm saying trauma, but it's my move away from all the baggage that word has, okay? So it doesn't do, it doesn't do enough work for some very bad trauma. It doesn't, it's not the greatest phrase, but if I use that phrase, that's what it's a placeholder for that. I think, yeah. So there's two types of stress disorders. There's T1 and T2. There's stress disorders that come from adverse events and like PTSD, okay? It comes from an adverse, you're basically a healthy person, you have an adverse event, and then you have a stress disorder. And then there is T2 complex stress disorders. They're extremely complex because they are adverse events that happen to people with attachment disorders. Okay, so when we talk today, we're going to talk about the first category first, and then the second category second. Now, in the popular psychology, this distinction's not made. People might have adverse events that then, because they've read popular psychology, they trace back to attachment disorders. This is like popular psychology bullshit, right? So it's very important to make sure we know which one we're talking about. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So yeah. So this is a distinction we need to make. Is there a hand raised? Katie, do you have your hand raised? Or oh, okay. You notice I'm going slow because it's a very big thing. Okay. So here's a naive question, but I think I really want us all to think about this question. So what is, if an adverse event happens to me, so we're talking about the T1, just a stress disorder. If an adverse event happens to me, what makes that adverse event push into the term trauma? What is added to the adverse event such that it's pushed into what we would call trauma? Right. So there's kind of like a hangover, right? Like I got really drunk, it was fun. And then now I have a hangover. There's some persisting suffering that has its origin in the adverse event, even though the adverse event is not happening and over. Okay. This is what we would call trauma. This persistence of something that is, so there's great words, but we could say it's unmetabolized psychological trauma, undigested, unintegrated. And if we are asked directly, why are you fearful? Is the thing you're afraid of there? You'll say no, but undeniably my nervous system is dysregulated. Right? So this is what we call trauma. A lot of adverse events happen to us. Sometimes we like to tell the story, and the fact that we went through it and got through it makes us feel good. And life is filled with these things. So what we are noticing now is that we have persistent dysregulation. Any kind of dysregulation. Doesn't have to be anxiety and fear. It could be like avoidance and just like you just tune out, right? When everything, like certain type of people come into the room and you're just like, you can't think, you're just tuned out, right? So there's some kind of dysregulation in your body that is happening, whose source you understand is not in the events in the present, but somehow tied to an adverse event in the past. Is everybody good enough with that definition? Okay, so this is what we're working with in T1. Okay, so one of the questions then I want to ask you is, what is it that persists? It's not an easy question, but just think about it. Just what is it that persists? There's some kind of affect dysregulation, right? So you notice something in your body. And what else? So I'm in a situation, my body becomes dysregulated. What happens such that I then tag the origin of that to my previous adverse event? Does a psychologist run into the room with a flag that says adverse event? No. So, okay, so somebody's saying it. What happens is you have a dysregulated body, and then you have a story of cause and effect that tags what's happening to you to a prior adverse event. Okay? If that didn't happen, if you were, you know, like just wondering what is going on with you, but it's this retroactive sense making that is associated with your dysregulated body. That is the piece you can cut. That's the leverage point in the work. You're dysregulated, then something happens. Could have, you could see a person, the movie starts to play subtly or very strongly. And that's the piece you can cut. That's the piece to cut. That move that happens to you. Okay. Yes. So therapists need to probe in a way that points you to what is happening in your body, right? So I asked you, like I could ask you to think about it, and I say, oh, what just happened? Because the point of the therapeutic process here is not for me to understand the story, but for me to be able to point to you, ooh, did you see? You weren't in your body. You went, ah, your body gets dysregulated, and then instead of sticking with it, you went, ah, you search for a why, a what, a when, a who, why me. All these things come into your awareness. And that's what you need to control. So the first thing is to notice, I don't know, for me, it definitely comes on this side. This is a different thing. This is a justification system. But for me, it's like this, okay? So, yes, so what is the root cause? Now, this is highly problematic in my my view. One of the problems with early childhood trauma, so right now we're just talking about adverse events that can happen in your adult life. The earlier it is, the more difficult it is, because what happens is that as adults, we start searching for reasons why. Why do children die in car crashes? Why did my mother keep inviting that man over when she knew? I can tell she knew he was abusing me. Why? This is a infinite loop that can't be solved. It can't be solved. And that's another thing. You could be, are you fascinated with the puzzle of solving the question, or are you trying to get rid of the persistent dysregulation in your body? So if you could take a magic pill and get rid of the persistent dysregulation in your body, you might find yourself unsatisfied because you're hooked on the why. You're hooked on what I actually call a God problem. We can get to there later. But the point of this work is to notice these micro phenomenology of what happens to you when you're in a dysregulated state. So we all agreed that the problem with trauma is that a previous adverse event has persistent dysregulation in the now. That's the problem. You didn't say a previous adverse event didn't have an explanation. You said the problem is it continually dysregulates my body in the now. And so I say, okay, want to commit to learning how to regulate your body in the now. And if you say yes, then the little voice in your head says, but why me? Why? And so this is the thread you have to cut in my work. Now, we can replace that question with a higher metacognitive explanation. It won't tell you what was he thinking? Did he go to hell? It won't tell you those kind of personal explanations. It will ask the question, what is life such that people have to go through existential precarity? What is it about people that we go through? See, it's a different kind of question, right? So it's not that we don't mentalize that question, but we take it out of the personal and the past, and you're trying to create an integrative narrative. We cut that, but we say, oh, but there's a metacognitive way we can ask a higher question, because it's just not my adverse experience. There's people all over the world. What is it about the human condition such that they're suffering at this level? What is it about, reality such that God lets babies die in car crashes, right? If you try to answer the what, where, when, why here, does everybody know what this means? It's like personal. I'm personally trying to answer about me. Then I'm going to have to say, well, because that abuser was abused by his parents, and his parents were abused by his parents, and they survived the Holocaust. And then eventually you're mad at God because he did a lousy job. That's where that leads. It's called the God problem. Yeah, that Margaret, whoever said that's Forrest Landry's, right? This is very, very sophisticated understanding of that. So I'll speak to that. You said omniscient. I'm just going to use the term third person perspective. The reason why you can't figure this out is because all adverse events that become traumatic lack a third person perspective. So when you're a kid and you get traumatized, you don't have any clue what this person is like, where your parents, you can't come out and have a third person perspective on what is happening. You just experience it. And this is the search for what Margaret said, the omniscient or third person perspective is what creates the persistent dysregulation of your body. So we can combine, it's Dan Brown's work, Diana Fosha. They say that when you break through trauma, you get this truth sense. It's a metacognitive understanding at a very much larger reality. It fills you with compassion, not only for yourself, it basically becomes very allocentric, that this is the way the world is, that's a very interesting question, right? I mean, there's ways to answer that question in terms of how, for example, as a species, we have a certain cognitive or psychic sophistication at a very early age, but we neither can communicate nor do we have any power. And this creates a certain kind of existential precarity that other creatures don't have. If you're a turtle and you wake up out of your shell, and your mother's not there, and there's no one to help you. There's no reflective awareness. There's no, you're not traumatized by it, right? I had a class once where a student asked me, she was dating a Chinese doctor, and she said that he grew up in the country and his parents went to work in the fields every day. And when he was young, they would tie him into his crib. And he told the story of like one day he figured out how to get out and open the window, and he went running out. And this would seem like a completely traumatic event. And she said, is he like so traumatized that he's dissociated from the trauma? And I'm like, no, it's rural China, where like this is like a pretty tragic situation, you know? So we're trying to control this other elaboration on top of the adverse event that persists, that is the root cause of your dysregulation. Your root cause of your dysregulation in the present is not the adverse event. It's the cyclical nature of the mind wanting answers, wanting a third person perspective, wanting intervention, right? You can't intervene. Trauma is like, you know, the people at the pop-up school, you know, the basic equation of a living being is arousal, perception, actions that satisfy. And when you traumatize, you have no actions that can satisfy the arousal that's happening. You're stuck in an arousal loop. So the first move is to say, I am dysregulated, not because of an adverse event that happened in the past, but because of the elaborations that I continue to put forth in the present. In other words, what is instigating, or the source of your trauma, is effort you are putting forth today, not something that is you're a passive victim of. You're actually putting forth the questioning, the worrying, the frustration that you have packaged around this narrative of this adverse event. Now, that sounds like it's a little harsh, but now you see, I say, you are doing something today that is persisting, creating this persistent dysregulation. You are doing it. You have the ability to stop doing it. It's not something in the past that you can't get at, that you have no control over, that is not really well understood, that is the source of what is happening to you today. It does not persist through some kind of morphic field. Yeah, Kim, we could talk about this in a little bit. Like, there's people who have go through traumatic situations that have the experience that they have choice, and that they made choices. This is tricky, depending on how old people are. Okay, so for example, children often feel bad. Older children of abusive parent often feel they're choosing to be abused, so their younger sibling doesn't get abused. So the younger you are, the more questionable is the assumption that there was choice and intention in the victim's participation. The older you are, the more you can make a case for that, right? So I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but it's very, very, very tricky. But it is important in the now to establish that you have agency over cutting the cord, so you're no longer dysregulated. Now you see there's no guarantee nor offering that this will answer your questions. It's needing to answer the questions is the part of the persistent thing. There are people who do this work, and I can't remember, I couldn't find it, but this one guy is talking about these kinds of interventions, and he went to a conference and he was talking to a mentor, and the mentor was noticing that he was actually examining his patients too strongly, because he was curious about like what actually happened, you know, like his own curiosity as a therapist, when the teaching is you don't really need to know what's happening. This is consistent with Dan Brown's. He does attachment disturbances. He does type 2 trauma, but same thing with him. You don't need to go and tidy up the past. You have to be able to take agency and be mindful of how this is functioning in the present. So I'm just going to show one slide, and then I think we should go to these questions, because it'll fill in through the kind of inquiry that you have. Does that sound good? Okay, so here's the slide. Hey, Peter, I need to be able to share my screen. Okay, so so one of the ways we can look at this, part of my work, and it, you know, and Campbell didn't say this, but part of my work, for all of you who know my work, is trying to work at the lowest level of complexity as possible to get the maximum leverage, right? So, so the way I've been speaking is in very clear, simple terms about complex issues. All the work is in doing the work to notice what draws you in, to notice, to have control of that move and stay with the body, to work in the present, to notice the mechanisms of what persists, how you are putting effort into persistently recreating that condition. But what we want to talk about, what are the products of this story-making, inquiring examiner? The products are distortions. And so what you have here, what I would be working with if I was a therapist, is to look for what is operating in your experience, okay? And I would probe with certain questions. And so what we have here are false things and true things, positive and negative. And we have zones that relate to your affect and zones that relate to your cognition. So what I would be listening for, this comes from the dynamical maturational model, which is so complex. It's got like subsets and DS 0.5 point, you know. So this is what I think is the useful bones underneath it. And so I could have, for example, a false negative affect around something. So I'm having an experience, there's nothing going on, but I start to have a negative affect. That's false. It's not inappropriate. It's not in the real now with that. But I also might be incapable of having a true negative affect. Like someone is being an asshole to me and I continue to be a people pleaser because I can't have a true negative affect. Like, fuck you, you're an asshole. You see how this works? I don't want to have false negative affect, but I want to be capable of having true negative affects. I don't want to have false positive affects, like, you know, when you fall in love with a narcissist and you can't constantly like give them a break and stuff like that. But I want to have true positive affects. I want to be able to let them invade a true positive feeling. I want to let that be able to encompass and overflow into me. And then the same is true for cognitions. I don't want to have a false negative cognition, my interpretation, my schema, my bias, but I want to be able to make a true negative interpretation of a situation. And the same with positive. I don't want to make false positive stories just as a coping mechanism, but I want to be able to, in declarative terms, make true positive stories. And so when we talk about dysregulation, these are the products that distort, you know, your body's dysregulated, and these are the products of that dysregulation that distort your experience. And we would listen to, am I working primarily with the inability to have a true negative affect? Or am I working with the inability to have a true positive affect? And there's, of course, they all blend into each other, but most people take a pretty strong typology that you can kind of hone in on and work with it as for your maximum leverage as a therapeutic methodology. Okay, we can go to questions. How do we want to do questions, Peter?
Campbell, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was actually curious to see if, Bonnie, how you were feeling about sensing into that experiment that we were talking about in the description, how take the temperature of the room, kind of see. Before we move into questions, I'm kind of curious about that.
In which way? As a demo or as a breakout groups?
As a demo, I think would be good. Kind of instantiate some of the processes that we're talking about.
Okay, so one way that I've worked with this in groups is through having people experience their trauma and talk to me without words. Okay, this is works really effective when you're very young. Because when people talk about their trauma when they're very young, you can see how the adult has elaborated and reinterpreted it a million times. And so, so it looks something like this, like, pick one, one of my adverse childhood events, thousands that I could pick. I'm going to tell you something, and I told him where to go, and this is it, and then I told him, but there's go, and you tell and yes, yeah, okay, so that's when I ripped my purple Easter dress on a exposed nail on the house my parents were building. I remember it to this day. That's how I knew, it's a significant event. It's not, it's the content of these things aren't important, but that was what I was relaying. And this is a way to, because of the way we are, when our nervous system is dysregulated, thoughts come up. And we can create actions that satisfy by using our mouth and vocalizations, but we don't want the little Looney Toony script to come. So we say, yes, the body wants actions that satisfy. In this moment, we're highly communicative people, but I want to serve that beautiful function. If I can turn it into an action or dance, that's what artists do. They take trauma and they turn it into dance and stuff like that. Then I can satisfy part of the loop that is working for me without getting into the part of the loop that doesn't work for me. So we had talked earlier about whether or not someone would want to do a demo. Or not.
Does that speak to anybody? Anybody feel like they want to volunteer? Thank you. Oh, Katie, awesome. Yeah, great. Thanks for volunteering.
Okay, so can we, everybody else, I think, why don't we have everybody else shut their videos down so Katie's not staring at people staring at her. Okay, so you can afterwards, you can tell, just like I did, just a little bit about it, but you never want to go into like, you don't want to retranslate your sharing, okay?
Like enacting my response during the event, or more like how I think about it now.
Yeah, so I'm just going to ask you to share your event, and you're not going to use words. If you're like me, when I was done, I wanted to tell everybody what the words were, but we don't want you to do that. So I'm just preempting that. Now, I did share what the situation was, but that's because it was somewhat trivial. And for this to really work, you should notice if there's a desire to speak real words, and just let that go, okay? And if it comes up, you can just go ahead and speak, express without words again. Now, that may not happen to you. It happens, it just happened to me. I noticed that I had a need. It might have been because I'm more down, teaching, but we don't want to destroy the experience by then giving it language. But then you can tell us what it felt like to go through this process. Does that make sense? Okay, let's take 5 deep breaths, and you just think of what you're going to share. And when you're ready, you start, and when you're ready, you stop. Is there more?
Good.
Okay, thank you. So somebody else want to try it before we debrief? Campbell, you got your hand raised, or is that a clap? I can't tell.
Oh, just clapping. Thanks.
Oh,
Good job.
anybody else want to participate? And then we can debrief.
Sure, I'll go.
Okay, great. So couple deep breaths, and then you start when you want and you stop when you want. Awesome. Awesome. One more, and we can. These are just little demos. Obviously, this is just to give you a sense of where it could go and how you could build on it. We have a timestamp and a screen, and it's not the best of situations, but having also people witness, it's not like we're listening. Patricia, do you want to go? Awesome. Feel what it feels like to be in the presence of these shares. It allows the witness to be present in a different way also. Because my curiosity stream in my mind is not online. So in a group setting, it can really shape the exchange in a different way. Do people feel that, witnessing this in a different way? Did you feel that you were witnessing something that was presencing just now, not going backwards? Like I was watching Margaret now, I was watching Patricia now, I was watching Katie now, I was watching the people who they are now. I felt, whereas my little brain, if you had used words, I'd be curious, I'd be having pictures of who was around that you're talking, all this stuff, and then that would get very transpersonal, and we'd all be in this mass psychosis of projection. Which it could be fun if you want to do that, but yeah. Okay, thank you so much for demoing. And if you want to comment now, Patricia, Katie, or Margaret, go ahead.
Can you hear me? I can share that brought a lot of heat. Like I felt afterwards my whole body get warm, like my temperature rise several degrees, and I felt kind of the way that I started like vibrating more. And like that experience was one where someone was directing an intense amount of anger to me as a child. And it was interesting to feel the way that I could like feel that anger in my body now. And it was really trippy, Bonnie, when you just shared how like witnessing, we're experiencing the now, experiencing the traumatic event or adverse event. And that like kind of brought this moment of trippiness where I like felt my mental vision kind of fractalize very concretely and feeling I kind of subscribe to like this committee of mind. So kind of really having some strong pictures of the committee of mind of very strong voices, like speaking in harmony at the same time.
Patricia, yeah.
Okay, so it was really weird because it became three-dimensional. Whereas normally when I speak about it, it's flat. And it's sort of like, I didn't know all that was going on. So it was sort of like I was witnessing myself there along with everyone.
I found that taking the words away, like I put myself back into that situation and was remembering the words that I spoke, but taking the words away kind of allowed me to just be more in the emotions. And I was noticing how strange my emotional reaction was, just like kind of reacting like it was funny and like, oh, hey, cool, I'm gonna dip, like, how about you do this, I'm gonna take care of it. I was like walking into like a violent, very like imminent threat of murder in my living room the morning of a calculus exam, and like, okay, cool guys, I'm gonna take the dog to the friend's house and see ya, and then taking the exam.
Yeah, so you get insights into what it's made up of, but they're right here that you can work with, you know. And like when I did mine, I noticed in front of you while I was doing it that I felt bad because I felt like I should have been able to take care of that dress. Like I could feel the you know, it's childhood. I would call it guilt, but it's such a it's so pre-verbal, you know, like I noticed that was in there, you know, like not that I was a victim, but that I should have done a better job or something, like, you know. And so what's interesting about doing it, if you're really in kind of process, it's fun to do with groups because nobody knows what your shit is, you know. And if, or you know, you can, and this witnessing in the present of somebody just being with this is interesting. But yeah, it's an insight generator. I mean, there's all kinds of like technical reasons why this is so simple but powerful. But yeah, what's layman call it? Sublinguistic, sub I want to say sublingual, but that's like when you put the thing in your yeah. All right, any other questions?
It looked like Steve Swedlow had an interesting question. I'm not sure if he still wants to unmute and share his question, or can drop your questions in the chat.
You mean David, I'm assuming.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I was curious, the model of kind of the false sense of you know, false cognitive, false affect, or whatever. I'm curious about how that model works when there is a true like crisis, like meaning crisis situation where everybody's, I mean, like people are having traumatic events walking into a restaurant because expectations are different, you know, and they can't handle something, and they're out of something and they feel defensive. Like everybody's having these hyper reactive things, and so it's like I don't even know where baseline expectation of what normal is anymore. And so in some way, this model as a oh, that, you know, this is in the normal range or this is not in the normal range, this is trustable or not trustable, this is true or false, feels like it's the model feels like I can't trust it. But it's interesting, the embodiment exercise looks really good. Like, that I'm not having to put words to it, not having to map it somewhere in some propositional way feels good. But I don't know if I can trust the propositional mapping when everything is messed up. And I'm kind of curious about the tension between those two noticings.
Yeah, no, I get that. And so the it comes out of the DMM, and the only really way to get a sense of it is if you read transcripts. And if you read transcripts, you get it. You get how they're marking certain statements from patients. So that I would say that just looking at the model, that's from their work, but it doesn't. It's not so much intellectual as understanding. Like when I read the transcripts, it's clear what they're pointing to.
Can I follow up? There's a little bit of a different focus, which is I notice I'm a circling practitioner, a circling facilitator, and also I noticed there are a couple of other modalities that give me access to something that I didn't know that I had access to. And there's the thing that's interesting is something like the where I typically go for understanding is less and less relevant to me. And it's something like it trains me to listen to a different, one of the things we say in circling all the time is this isn't therapy. So if you're coming here as if it's therapy, that's not what this is. This is a practice. It has a therapeutic impact. And so sometimes it's almost like, oh, wow, there's a lot that I can do for myself that isn't necessarily therapy with a model where I'm diagnosing something, but I'm just noticing, oh, wow, I have access to expressing and act. I was going to say normalizing, but what I really mean is relating to myself in a way that doesn't need intervention. Just because I'm noticing something. Oh, this is interesting. I actually can feel below where my words seem to cover something up. And so I like this notion, but it's not so much a critique of this model or any model in particular, but just noticing a difference of like, oh, there's something that we need to update.
So now if I answer your question in a different way, because I was answering it from like looking at the dynamic maturational model, but if I use it like how is it useful? I can use it, for example, when you said, everybody's, what's the new normal? You walk in and there's conspiracy theories and all this stuff. You can say, my nervous system is shot. Like it's just shot. That's a true negative affect versus, and so that would be healthy just to stop there. My nervous system is shot. Okay, can I work on some of the muscles? Or am I just gonna, but what I don't want it to do is create false positive affects or false positive or negative cognitions. But I can just say, okay, I have a true negative affect. I mean, I go through this like all the time. There are times when the system is just shot. And the way I can tell is I go to the barn and like the slightest little, I'm worried about the poor little mouse. And I start to like like become like, whose body is this, you know? And then I'm like, wow, my nervous system is shot. And so that's how you would use the model. And in dialogue, if you know the person enough, you can start to feel like the person who might say, my nervous system is just shot. And then they'll start to say, but you know, and then this person, he didn't really mean to be an asshole. And then all this false positive cognition will come to try to cope with the fact that your affect is just negative. So that's kind of how you work on it, you know, work with it for, it's just, if you have it in your head, it can help you kind of figure out the machinations of what's going on. You quickly hear people switch from negative to, you see it all the time on the internet, like the person's suffering and they're putting a positive spin on it. That's a false positive affect or false positive cognition, depending on if they're talking or just suffering. And then you see with histrionic personality disorder, a lot of false negative affect and stuff. So that's how I use the model. You know, the DMM is like all these sophisticated, complex systems, goes into infinite, what is it called? Combinatory explosions. But hopefully that's a little helpful. Penny or Sharon, I think your hand is raised, or your face slapping.
Yeah, or I'm high-fiving you. Bonnie, I had an example, if I could offer it, that I wonder if we could play with. So when in my previous life, when I worked as a therapist, we used a technique where somebody would write out the story of their trauma, and then they would read it, and they would read it out. And it was a very interesting thing where after reading out the details of it at a certain point in time, it would happen around like 10 or 12 times. And they'd get to the point where they were like kind of sick of reading out this piece of paper that was sort of factual, and it described maybe some emotional elements. And then all of a sudden it was like something would switch and the emotionality would change. So they no longer would experience it in the same way emotionally. It's like they went through kind of what you're describing. So I'm curious about any, thoughts about what might be happening there, because there was sort of this moment of not wanting, almost a resistance, which was part of the trauma of going back or talking about it. Once they talked about it and started reading it, there would be kind of an emotional reaction, and then it would completely neutralize. And after that, it would sort of normalize. And so I wonder how that fits in with what you're describing, because to me, there's a piece of the being in the sensing and being in the narrative frame in that are sort of coming apart and then coming together.
Yeah, so, there's a lot of versions. There's a lot of cool modalities that are versions of this. I mean, I can guess what's going on behind the scenes there. Did you say they were reading it over more than once? Yeah, so
like 12, 15 times.
Right, so basically, when you do that, if you read words over and over again, they bypass your semantic processing. It gets exhausted, and you're just making sounds. And so basically it's doing what I just did directly, just to make sounds. And what happens is that you're not trying to fight everything in the body, because you're dysregulated, you're thinking about the trauma, you want to speak, this is one of the ways we off vent that energy. And so you are doing that. I thought you were going to say, because this is also something that journaling will do, is if you journal about your trauma over and over again, you'll find that the story changes, and then you become suspect about the story. But that's kind of a long-term process. And I think they hinge on the same kind of mechanism of how we're put together. I would just suspect that once they have like a rest over a couple of weeks, then the story that they etched in stone might have been more reified, versus saying it over and over again at the time. Antoinette?
Greetings.
Hi.
I have I'm looking at this through the lens of Blackness
Mhm.
and Black forgiveness, that whenever something traumatic happens within the community, then we tend to go straight to forgiveness without the processing part. And putting that into the context of the model, that's the false positive affect. And then also looking at how the world expects Black folk to move through spaces that quickly. And so even the witnesses also have this false positive expectation. So there's this, the expectation and the fulfillment of that, which is, like, for me, rooted in slavery, subjugation.
Yeah. So I think that's real. If you're a minority and if you're a Black person in the US, you're not allowed to have negative affects. The society doesn't want you to have negative affects. Positive negative affects are even worse because they're true. I mean, true negative affects. I can't remember. I was listening to something on NPR where people were really naming this experience of feeling like you're not allowed as a Black person to have negative affects. That's a cultural imposition. So you develop a coping mechanism, but it'll distort. It exacts a price. Yeah, I would say, and I understand it better because of this NPR thing I was showing where they were talking a lot about what that felt like. And then of course, it's kind of like to prepare your child to live in that society, you teach them this kind of coping mechanism because it is useful. I mean, it's a practical use, but it doesn't liberate the psyche. It keeps, yeah.
Yeah, for me, that's how, like, in being beat, that Black mothers will say, I will give you something to cry about. So then it coaches the child to not shed tears. And if they do shed tears and they get beat for crying. And so I can see how it, like, negative affect. Cognition, I still don't have a full grasp of that. And so can you share how cognition factors into these cultural things as well?
First, I'll give you an example of false cognition. Then I'll try to think of cultural. Maybe if I give you an example, you'll have more insight into the cultural burden. So there are typical ones that I've read this transcript. The kid will come in with his mother into therapy, and his cognition is that his mother is mean to her when he's abusive to his mother. But, she nags me. She's always on my hand. She's like impatient. She's like this. And yet he's extremely abusive to her. And then she's bought into that. She's like, I wish you'd just be happy and stuff. So they both buy into this false cognition that she's the oppressor and he's the victim. Now, whether or not, he's pretty upfront about his false negative affect, she drives me nuts and this and that, but the interpretation is completely false. Yeah, so it's an interesting question, like what is the equivalent cultural burden on that? I don't think about that. I don't have, it's hard for me because I don't have personal experience. Except for women, women buy into false cognition all the time. Like I should have been there. In reality,
Dog is really going for it.
I'm sorry. He has a false cognition that there's a mass murderer at the door.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, time for, where's my Peter and Campbell? Time for one more question. Where are we?
I think we could fit one more in there if somebody has a juicy one to wrap us up on. I have just a quick question. If you could just talk about there, I feel like there's like a bit of a Venn diagram or overlap between the omniscient perspective and allocentric processing, which you mentioned, but they seem like there's some differences. Could you just tease out the distinction a little bit, that omniscient term that got brought up early?
Yeah, see, he's so clever, this one. And putting categories and ideas together. So what happens if you have an adverse event when you're young, you don't have, you get collapsed into egocentric. You can only see what's going on inside yourself. You can collapse into magical thinking. You don't have an external, you can't get allocentrics. You can't get allocentric about it. However, if you're an adult and you practice the allocentric posture, this is extremely powerful. This is dangerous to say because it puts the burden of intervention on the victim. But if you can stay awake, like while you're getting raped, and really look at what's going on, this will be extremely helpful to not have persistent adverse distortions going on. Now, it's very hard to do, but to stay in allocentric, like this is what's going on. In extreme sports, they hack this. Let me say this. So I'm not a clinician. I'm not really good at this. My interest, why I read all this and why I'm moving toward this model is because all these ideas are for human potential are in this literature now, but it's all inside the discipline of pathology. So there's a lot of really cool information inside trauma studies. This is what we're talking about. But what I would like to do is extract it into how to go from basic sanity to more highly developed people, right? So that allocentric move is part of that. Like, can I practice that muscle constantly? Now, it's more perceptual than omniscient, which is more like you're floating above the world and you're looking down at everything. That can be very dissociative. Whereas allocentric is, you know what's happening around you as something's happening to you. And I'll give you an example. Once I was skiing in the Sierra Nevadas, telemark skiing, but I'd never gone skiing before in my life. And I was young, and I had this boyfriend who was a great skier. You hike in like 20 miles into the Sierra. The Sierra Club has a cabin there, and you're basically out in the middle of nowhere. And I thought, well, I can ice skate. How hard could it be to ski? And we skied in. And then the next day he went telemarking up on the hills. And I was like practicing kind of skiing in the forest there. And this freak snowstorm came and dropped like, 8 inches, 10 inches of snow all of a sudden. And I couldn't see my tracks. I was completely lost in the forest in the middle of the Sierra Nevadas on skis. I'd never been skiing before. So I realized that the only way I could get out of there, because I knew that the cabin was near a lake. And I knew if I got high enough in the mountains, I could see the lake. And then I could just go to the lake, and no matter where, and just circumnavigate the lake until I found the cabin. This is like an adverse event, right? So I climbed and I climbed, I duck waddled and I duck waddled, and the storm turned into like one of these ice storms, and the whole side of the mountain was all ice, and I had to duck waddle. And I got to the top of the mountain and I looked, and there was no lake. There was only other mountains. I was on the wrong side of a mountain or something. So, so what happened to me is I was so overwhelmed at that point, like emotionally, I was exhausted. My arms were like falling off. I was so overwhelmed, like my nervous system, that I laid down in the snow, and I had like a little epileptic fit. And I flopped around in the snow like a flounder on the bottom of a boat, right? And this completely reset my nervous system. And I got up and I was like an animal, like, I'm just gonna climb the next fucking mountain. And if it's not that, it'll be the next. And I could see all the force, and I could smell where I was like a fucking animal. No fear. I mean, the amount of endorphins or whatever, it was like, it was just the greatest feeling to be that simple, that perceptive, that intentional. And I remember the line from Emily Dickinson came in my mind. After a great something, a formal feeling comes. And so I just went down and went up another mountain. And then I saw the lake. And then when I was going down, I had to go down the mountain on my butt because I didn't know how to ski, and I almost went into this crevasse. I like literally almost died. And then I got to the lake, and I had to go around like 3/4 of the lake, and I got in. And my poor boyfriend, he was like, was cooking. He like cooked like 17 batches of spaghetti because he didn't know what to do with himself. And he's like, I would have gone to look for you, but then I would have been lost. And I went upstairs and I went to sleep. And I couldn't sit up for 3 days because my muscles were so like the muscles I had used were all these big knots stuff. And then on the 4th day, we skied back out. But it's that experience of losing the ego and trusting the body and trusting perception and getting very clean that is informed all my work. That's the allocentric posture. It's extremely powerful. And I think that a lot of these new age techniques are working backwards from what is possible. So maybe that's a good place to end. And it's not a traumatic, I tell the story, you see, it's not a traumatic event in my life at all.
Yeah, fantastic, Bonnie. What an epic story. I just think you can go in mountains and have an experience like that, and you'll learn all of the stuff. Yeah, thank you to everybody who asked great questions, and to the volunteers for that experiment today. It was a lot of fun. Thanks to Peter for hosting. And of course, to Bonnie. To check out more events, go to thestoa.ca if you like this. And tomorrow we're starting a new course on the core self. It's going to probably extend on a lot of these ideas with Bonnie. So hope to see you guys there tomorrow. Thank you so much, everybody.